Hello, you guys. So this is about the types of pollination. We're going to discuss the difference between the self-pollination and cross-pollination. And we're going to discuss what are the differences between insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. So let's start. First of all, pollination is two kinds. The self-pollination is done when pollen moves from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower. So this is called self-pollination. So self-pollination is when pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. Cross-pollination happens when pollen from the anther of one flower gets stuck on the legs of the bee or the butterfly or any kind of pollinator, and then this butterfly or bee or whatever insect goes to another flower of the same kind, of course, and those pollen grains will fall on the stigma of the other flower. So this is called cross-pollination. So cross-pollination is when pollen from the anther of one flower is transferred or moved to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. Now, flowers can be pollinated by wind or by insects. Now, the flowers that need the wind to pollinate them are different from the flowers that need insects to pollinate them. Let's discuss what's the difference. First, let's start with wind-pollinated flowers. Now, the flowers that need the wind to pollinate them don't need to attract insects and butterflies and bees and hummingbirds. They don't need to attract them, right? That's why they have small petals. They don't need bright colors to tell the insects and the animals to come to pollinate them. That's why they don't have petals, and they don't have a scent or a smell, and they don't have nectar. All of those three, they don't have them because they do not need to attract insects and animals, right? And also, pollen is produced in great amounts. They make a lot of pollen because the minute the wind blows a little bit, the pollen would be carried by the wind, because remember, they need to be pollinated by the wind. Also, this pollen is very light and smooth, so that again it would be easy for the wind to carry it. And anthers are loosely packed and dangle out because, when they are loosely packed, this would make the pollen that they carry easy for the wind to carry it. And the stigma here, which is the female part of the flower, it hangs outside of the flower, and it is feathery or nut-like. And that's because this stigma needs any chance to catch as many pollen grains as possible. Okay, so these are some examples of wind-pollinated flowers. Now, the insect-pollinated flowers are the opposite, because if they need the insects, then they need to attract them. And that's why they have large and brightly colored petals, and they have sweet scents, and they usually have nectar. All of those three, they have them in them so that they can attract as many insects as possible, because those insects are their pollinators. Also, they do not have a very big amount of pollen. They have a moderate or a medium amount of pollen, because they will not waste a lot of pollen, because they don't need the wind pollination. Also, look here, they said pollen often is sticky or spiky, and that's because it needs to get stuck on the legs of the insects or on the bodies of the animals that come nearby the flowers. Also, the anthers are firm and inside the flower, and that's because they need to brush against the insects so that the anther won't fall off whenever an insect comes. They need to be firm, okay? And they stay inside the flower because they need to brush against the insects, that any kind of insect that passes by to collect nectar. Also, the stigma is inside the flower, so that this insect, when it brushes against the stigma will catch as many pollen as possible. And on top of the stigma, it has a gluey stuff. It has a sticky coating so that the pollen can get stuck on it. Okay, and these are some examples of insect pollinated flowers, and that's it. Thank you so much.